Good morning, everyone. The Finance and the Investment Cell of Shri Ram College of Commerce welcomes you to today's session of Shri Ram Finance Forum. We are honored to have amongst us our esteemed speaker, Professor Abhijit Sen. We also welcome respected Principal Ma'am, Faculty Advisor of FIC SRCC Saroj Ma'am, faculty members of Shri Ram College of Commerce, and the participants. Professor Abhijit Sen is an established name within the world of academia. His work has had great influence and impact in our country, earning him a Padma Bhushan for his excellent work. He has been instrumental in the success of a number of official commissions, including the Planning Commission, the High Level Committee on Long Term Grain Policy, Commission for Agriculture Costs and Prices, the 10th Plan Subgroup on Agriculture Economics and Rural Development. Professor Sen has also been advisor consultant with international organizations such as the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, the International Labour Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, amongst others, making a wider impact and improvement in the world. We are really grateful that you could spend time with us for this enriching interaction. I would now like to invite our respected principal, Professor Simrat Kaur, to welcome sir.
Thank you so much, Professor Sen. It is indeed a delight and an equal pleasure and a privilege that you will be enriching our students and also people like us who are so much involved in things which are going around, especially in the context of your today's lecture. I think it is so wide. We could have taken a full day session also, given your vast experience in the areas that you'll be speaking on. But very briefly, if I try to cover up whatever is happening in Indian agriculture and the climate change and the current economic slowdown, it comes very clear that somehow the Indian policymakers have not given so much emphasis to the Indian agriculture as the other areas, including the 91 reforms. They were more focused on every other sector, but somehow the agricultural sector was not into the forefront. And barring the reforms that took place of Green Revolution in the 60s, agriculture kind of, though heavily subsidized in terms of the fertilizers and other aspects, was somehow the productivity enhancement techniques such as irrigation or roadways, or even thinking of, let's say, setting up a non-rural farm which could provide employment opportunities to agriculture was not much of a focus across the globe. And while we are still not giving emphasis to agriculture, comes the onslaught of depleting food security levels and supplemented with the climate change adverse impacts on the productivity. Very quickly, if you look up, FAO, and Sir has had a vast experience with organizations such as FAO. For a food secure person, it's not just the availability, but also the accessibility and the utilization of the food grains, which would make a person healthy. And in this context, India and also so many other South Asian countries, Latin America and Sub-Saharan, are not doing too well when it comes to the aspects of food security. And in general, when we talk about the climate change impacts of food security, you'll realize that it is the extreme volatility, both in terms of the rainfall as well as the temperature levels, and the uncertainties associated with them, which has again had an adverse impact on the income levels of the farmers and their monthly household consumption expenditures. And across all this, if you again look up a couple of parameters, for example, the climate risk index, India is still amongst the most climate risk countries, so are other countries of South Asia. So until a regional cooperation is there, talking about a policy in isolation probably may not be too good. Coupled with the fact that we talk about the water security index, India is still as a hazardous nation. And we are still exporting rice, which is so intensive in water. So in a way, a country which is not having sufficient water and our index is 1 out of 5, we end up exporting an agricultural grain which is intensive in water. So we are exporting water implicitly. Also, if you have a gauge, the agricultural orientation index, which basically means for every 1% that the agriculture is contributing to the GDP, in return, how much does the government give back to the agricultural sector as a percentage of its total expenditure? This has been low across most of the nations, which means that a particular sector, which is still contributing in India about 17% of GDP and more than 65% of employment, is probably not getting the same amount of return from the government sector. But what the current economic downturn, actually the economic stimulus package, which was given on account of the pandemic COVID-19, brought in reforms in the agricultural sector, which was primarily the APMC Act. And to this extent, if we are opening up of the incomes of the farmers, supplemented with the efforts of the governments of, let's say, things like proper diversification and disposition, I think one has to refocus on the agricultural sector, prioritize it much more. And the topic again says about the inclusiveness. So inclusiveness, unless you focus on the agricultural sector, will not be possible. And with Professor Sen's vast experience, even to do with the pricing policies of the MSPs and so much knowledge, I think, sir, I'm personally looking forward to every word that you say over here, because this is indeed a privilege, and I'm not saying it only for the heck of saying, sir. We look forward, my all set of students, my faculty, and I also, sir, personally look forward to your enriching words of wisdom in this area of agriculture, economic growth, inclusiveness, climate change, and food security. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us.
Definitely. Now I would like to invite Professor Sen to begin this enriching discourse and share his views upon the topic that we have all discussed, all we have gathered here to discuss.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Madam Principal. In fact, you are so good, and you made life slightly easier for me today, because when I accepted to speak to Kirodimal students, who I do almost every year, I was wondering exactly how do I put the mix. Now, I've got a set of questions which was sent by the organizers. There's no reference to agriculture at all in those. There's one question on climate change and one on whether or not the future development should focus more on creating jobs where returning migrants have gone back to, or to bring them back to the old urban pattern of development. These were the two which were related in a sense to agriculture and rural development. All the other questions were really about China, about Atmanirbhar, about the general economics of the crisis that we are now passing through. Now, what I'll do is, I'll actually take up some of the issues which have nothing to do with agriculture to start off with, and come back to the rural issues at the end of my roughly 1 hour, which I expect to speak. And I would urge, if there are further questions, somehow the organizers try and collect them, and maybe I'll cut my speech a bit short. We can pick that up. Now, given the questions that I've got, as I said, many of them refer to China, about our dependence on China, about whether or not we can actually use the opportunity today to get markets which China has now. Can we use Atmanirbhar initiatives to actually do all that? But most importantly, I think most of the questions really are trying to ask, where are we now and what do we see in the near horizon? And to again take a word from China, unfortunately, these are very interesting times. We really don't know where the world is entirely headed towards, because we have a number of things going on, not just in the Indian economy, but the world over. Of course, what plays to the news most is the pandemic, which began in China, which the Chinese have correctly been thoroughly criticized for not having fully shared, but which, after all, the Chinese have put below their belt. They more or less have got out of that pandemic, and it's now chuta-puta cases which keep coming up. Whereas the rest of the world and America, then Brazil, and now India, the three top countries, are actually battling that particular pandemic the most, but a whole host of nations are doing it as such. So that's number one, the pandemic. Number two is, of course, that given that the pandemic has focused on the role of China, there's a lot of criticism for China, not just about the pandemic, but about other things as well. There was a hope for many in India that as China suffers from the pandemic, and as the rest of the world tries to actually reduce China's importance in the world mercantile trade, will India be able to take up a role that has so far eluded it? On that, let me answer straight away. Unfortunately, at the moment, that does not seem to be really on the cards right now, simply because not only has China actually started going back to production, almost back to pre-pandemic levels, the rest of Asia is doing so much better than India that jobs which China might lose, and there is reasons China might lose markets because of the way American policy works, those markets are more likely to go to countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, all of Vietnam. All of them have tackled the pandemic much better, have tackled the lockouts which followed the pandemic in a more sensible manner, and their economies are raring to go. And inherently, for the last 7 or 8 years, they are the ones who have been actually getting the foreign trade side right, whereas we have been rather bad at our growth of exports. And so there is no real reason to believe that we will be able to turn this thing around, given that amongst the rank orderings in Asian nations, clearly we are the worst in the pandemic sense. And most of you may well have read the article today by Kaushik Basu in Indian Express, who said that maybe the way we responded to the pandemic through the sort of lockouts that we had actually made things both for the worse, both for the pandemic itself as well as for the economy. Now that's a view that he has. I don't need to subscribe to that view completely, but it's a strong view, widely shared. And what I want to do is to develop on one or two issues that emerge from there and in spirit of the questions which are put to me, try to look forward rather than look into the past. Now, looking forward, one important thing to remember is that sooner or later, we will be out of this pandemic. It might happen in 2 months. It might happen only when the vaccines are available, in which case it might take up to a year. But we'll be out of it sooner or later. And almost everyone who is around now will still be around then. So it's not as if we're going to have lots of people dying, even if we can't control the pandemic for a year or so. We'll all be around, or most of us, maybe not an old person like me, but generally speaking, the country will be around. The question really is, what will the country's economy look like? And what are the plus points and what are the negative points? Now, the plus points, as I said, one of the plus points was supposed to be that maybe we actually pick up where China has left off. Now, this is still a possibility, but as I indicated right at the beginning, other countries are more likely to step smartly into that role than we are. We are actually going through our own economic crisis, the dimensions of which preclude a lot. What does it preclude? Now, what has happened in India, unlike in the rest of the world, is that very soon after the magnitude of the crisis was becoming evident, we had a complete lockout, which was possibly the most stringent anywhere in the world. And it was announced at a very short notice. It created a situation in which a lot of people wanted to go home, then started walking, and we know all of that. The main point about it is that the economy suddenly shut down, so that figures which are coming in of output figures relating to April and now slowly in May is that output has fallen very, very significantly. Taxes have fallen very, very significantly. And the hope is that we will have what they call a V-shaped escape out of this as soon as the pandemic things are over, as soon as the full effects of the unlock, which is now in progress, manifest themselves. Now, locking and unlocking may be one part of why the economy shut down. But there is another part, of course, to the economy, which you as economists all know very well, which is no economy is going to actually revive unless demand revives. And unlike most other countries, and this includes not just all our Asian friends, it includes the United States, it includes all of Europe, have had a very massive fiscal stimulus, which we in India tried, in a sense, to emulate in two lots. we talked about a large set of measures, including, of course, food, but also credit guarantees for the MSMEs. Unfortunately, a lot of that has not worked itself on the ground as much as many had expected. And in any case, much of it, for example, the loan for the MSMEs, were in the realm of loans rather than a fiscal commitment by the center. And that's been the major characteristic of our attempt at stimulus, which is our caution to keep fiscal deficit in mind when we know very well that you can't really have a stimulus without letting the fiscal deficit open up. I mean, the United States had opened up its fiscal deficit by almost 10% of GDP. And the same is true of Europe. The same is true of Malaysia. The same is true of Japan. We have kept more or less trying to maintain the fiscal deficit where it was. And that obviously makes any stimulus extremely limited. And that limit comes in the Indian case from a major source, which I don't think we are appreciating as well. But in coming days, how we play that is going to be the real signifier of whether we do well or bad. And that particular issue is that throughout the last 3 months, the real action has been at the level of the states. They're the ones which have been grappling with the pandemic. They are the ones who have been actually trying to keep whatever economic efforts are going on in rural areas, on agriculture. And in fact, luckily, we were expecting a record Kharif harvest, and we've got a record Kharif harvest. So on the agricultural side this year, despite the pandemic, we've done rather well. That credit for that must largely go to the states. It's not the center. That they were able to keep supplies running, they were able to keep, to some extent, markets functioning. And when the states were doing all of this, they were doing so while their revenues, tax revenues, were going to near zero. In other words, states were spending a lot of money, giving money to their staff, spending more money because of the pandemic, all in the middle of a revenue collapse. And the way they were doing it was by borrowing upfront, so that in the last 3 months, they more or less borrowed what they were allowed to for the whole year. In other words, we are about to see in the next 6 months or so that if the fiscal deficit constraints are rigidly imposed upon the states, and states have only been given about a 0.5% leeway there. If these are rigidly imposed on the states, you might see the reverse of a stimulus. That is, instead of demand rising, because the states are forced to cut back on whatever expenditures that they had budgeted for, most of them in infrastructure, they will not be able to do it, although the lockdown is being unlocked. So the pertinent question is, starting now, do we get our growth story back? My view on that is fairly clear. If we are fiscally conservative as we continue to be, I'm afraid we will not succeed. We might make more of a mess than we set out to. And in the meantime, of course, as far as the central government is concerned, other concerns have become important. Defense has become more important, in many senses, very urgent. And if through it all, if you keep up a rigid fiscal stringency, you cut back on all those activities which are really the stimulus type activities. It hasn't yet happened, but the hope that we will get a massive V-shaped response now rests only on whether or not consumers who can now go out to the malls actually start suddenly going on a spending spree. Maybe that will happen, but it's certainly not what I'm seeing around me just as yet. And if it doesn't, then sooner or later, you will have to have stimulus. And the later you push it, the costs of not doing so are going to be larger. I think this is one of the lessons which economists always learn. In fact, in the first year, in fact, even before they come to college, about Keynes. And they also learn about the fiscal responsibility and why, things can go wrong if you don't have some sort of discipline on that responsibility. But clearly, the present situation, the world over, is one where I think very, very few people, very few indeed, will disagree that fiscal prudence amounts today to very imprudent behavior, given that we do know the way the economy functions has the main Keynesian content still alive. So that's one part of the issue, and I'm not going to go into that one very much more. But let me go on to something which these questions are actually pointing to. One part of our response was the stimulus package. As I said, much of that consisted of loans of one kind or the other than the food part, which was a prudent thing to do and should have been done quicker, more efficiently, because we had huge stocks which we didn't know anything what to do about. It didn't cost us money. The stocks had already been paid for by the government. It was simply a question of releasing them. Now, the other side of the government thing has been this idea of Atmanirbhar. And Atmanirbhar has been interpreted in some of these questions as being self-reliance, to push for self-reliance, and in some sense at the cost of economic openness. And this idea that we should, as an economy, be less liberal than a lot of people and a lot of very sensible economists have been saying. The path we've been following since 91, of which, of course, I used to be a critic, that maybe we should be actually going a few steps backward. Why? Because one of the consequences of the great liberalization of the Indian economy has been that as a manufacturing power, we have actually done very badly. Some of our services have grown, but manufacturing, we have simply kept the door open for the Chinese and others linked to that nexus to actually grab most of the pie. And India is not the only country. President Trump and the United States more or less keep saying the same thing. And so it is true that the world over, there does seem to be a certain degree of step back to a more closed, less open economy, an idea of nationalism going hand in hand with jobs for the boys, less competition from cheap imports, and that sort of thing. Now, clearly, there is and has been, in my opinion, a role for an industry policy which we didn't play for much of in the period since 1991 to the extent that we should have. If getting back to some of them is what Atmanirbhar is all about, not bad. But there is a tendency also to actually think in terms of, let's close certain things down, let's not allow imports from China at all. Of course, this has not been done sensibly so far. But there is a clamor to some extent about that. And that, I think, would be a fair disaster because so many of our industry, to the extent that they exist, are linked to that system of inputs, and you would actually have to proceed slowly to build up the chains. If you actually proceed quickly, in fact, the superstructure will collapse before you can build it from the basement onwards. Now, there are other things about this idea of Atmanirbhar which bring me to what I really wanted to talk about, which is inclusiveness. In some of the questions that have been put, it's almost assumed that inclusiveness means Atmanirbhar. Well, I'm not so sure that it does. It's not certainly clear that it is always the case that trying to forge a closed economy will mean an economy which is more equal. Certainly, in some of the aspects of the Indian economy before liberalization, we put too much weight on more capital-intensive sectors than on labor-intensive sectors than those countries which were more liberal. In fact, that was the main argument, one of the main arguments for liberalization. So that can replay itself But the fact is that, as it now turns out, it's not just the capital intensive sectors that we allow to not grow as rapidly as they were doing then, but also in many labor intensive sectors, we were outcompeted by other countries. So would it be the case that Atmanirbhar would bring that back? Well, if it is or it isn't, if it's left to the market, we'll only wait and see, and possibly it wouldn't. What it requires is policy, and at the moment at least, I do not see any of the structures which can actually lead to the formulation of such a policy, because that needs guidance, it needs incentives, it needs going back, not necessarily to full-fledged planning, but it certainly needs to think in terms of a more active role for subsidies and taxes, for example. And at the moment, I do not see not just those mechanisms not there, given that the Planning Commission has gone and the state of the Niti Aayog, I don't even see an institution in government which is actually thinking seriously, or for that matter, has the capacity to do things, certainly in the short time. Therefore, I think like many other things, Atmanirbhar may be a good idea. It puts a perspective in people's minds. But whether it works out depends a lot, like, did demonetization do all the things it was supposed to do? Did, the sudden demand for a lockdown and stay at home, did that do all that? But having said all that, let me take a positive thing. One of the things that Mr. Modi has is he is able to convince people, and they trust him. A great evidence of that is that his popularity was unaffected by either demonetization or the GST rollout, which was a bit of a sham in some sense. But more importantly, that some things which need changes in behavior, for example, stopping open defecation, do seem to have done much better under this government than the. So people do say that what he's saying has substance, and many do put it into practice. And I think today, the fact that almost anywhere you go, people are wearing masks is not simply a matter that, it's a law that you wear a mask. I think the sense that wearing a mask is important, that maintaining distance is important, has had a much larger effect on the Indian population than it has, for example, on either the Brazilians or the United States, where the respective presidents have been less. I mean, the Brazilian president says no mask. The US president refuses really to take a stand on it either way. And all this does suggest that maybe there are behavioral changes which are taking place, which may act in a subterranean manner, and maybe positivity can come out through that. However, like many other things, we know about behavioral change only when they happen. And it's an open question whether that alone will be able to get out of the mess that we are in at the moment. Now, the big forward-looking question that comes out from the questions which have been put to me are that, look here, okay, we did badly, migrants all went back. But now there is this choice between should the migrants be brought back so that factories, shops, institutions where they were employed can again work back at a normal space? Or should we actually think in terms of creating jobs where the migrants have gone back to, think in terms of development of those regions, and in particular the rural regions where the migrants came from? Now, this is a big issue. This is a big issue because at the heart of that set of questions lies an old conflict between, for example, I mean, it may not be entirely accurate, but between, say, the Nehruvian and the Gandhian views of the economy. But certainly, it does focus on a question which Madam Principal highlighted in her opening comments, which is, have we actually neglected not just agriculture, but rural areas in our quest to have growth based essentially upon the urban infrastructure that already exists and growth of urban infrastructure around existing urban areas, which has attracted construction. It has reduced servicing costs. It has attracted migrants. Unfortunately, it has also meant very crowded spaces, and it has certainly meant a huge lack of inclusiveness, because it's not just that the urban areas have been non-inclusive. Resources which could have otherwise gone to less densely populated rural areas have not gone there. Now, this to me would be a starting point for a true set of questions regarding Atmanirbhar. Unfortunately, the Atmanirbhar story that we are now talking about does have this, but in a muted manner. It's much more about space, this, that, and less so about how can we actually think of a growth of an industry based on demand from rural India, producing close to where the consumers live, but utilizing the best in terms of technology. This is certainly something which is possible. It is certainly something which will have to be done if you're going to actually think in terms of anything remotely in terms of Atmanirbhar, including, for example, the opening up of agricultural markets, which again, Madam Principal correctly pointed towards. Because much of all of this would depend upon our ability to connect the dots. That is, we have to get a lot of people talking to each other, a lot of little places acting in a manner which is less controlled by their own state governments, and hopefully less controlled also by the central government, but are able together to build something which creates the critical mass for creating that demand, which at the moment, the only sectors where you are actually witnessing growth are agriculture, some rural services, and of course, the entire IT and the sort of mechanisms through which all of us are communicating at the moment. Now, I say this because the role of IT in making this possible is something which was obvious for a long time. But somehow our IT majors got into a big business which was servicing clients in the West. We did not build up an infrastructure, we didn't build up the apps required for communication. Why is TikTok there? Why was that space not filled up by Infosys or Tata? So it needs behavioral change, and these behavioral changes on the part of our businesses. The big player today is Jio. Let's see what they do. But, my time is kind of rolling. But in this, let me take on certain critical parts of the questions regarding inclusiveness. The one thing we know is that India, left to herself, is not inclusive. We are a very structured society. Unfortunately, the institution of caste, and to some extent also of religious divides, imposes all sorts of categories, all sorts of thinking, and all sorts of behavior which are not conducive to inclusiveness. These are less in certain parts of the country, they're more in certain other parts of the country. But without taking this head on, as indeed Gandhi's mission number one was, it's really difficult to think of inclusiveness. And this is one area in which Gandhi and Nehru were pretty close, although their ways of thinking were slightly different. Now, the real problem of inclusiveness in India is, as I said, that we are a country where the rural population is still about 60%. And while the share of agriculture is going down, there is a rural economy which is non-agricultural. And in the rural economy, that share is going up. It's going up because of services, because of a whole set of local manufacturing, even some manufacturing choosing to set up in rural areas rather than urban areas because of land costs. But it's not a growth which has led to what we call inclusiveness so far. And one of the reasons this has happened is that the sort of concentration of consumer demand that we have in urban areas, the sort of demand patterns that, for example, drive the overcrowded roads that we see are not fully replicated in rural areas, although today in rural areas, the motorcycle is almost as big an evil as the motor car is in urban areas. But nonetheless, what is important is that the demand drive is something which every now and then industry just say that fast-moving consumer goods will come from the rural sector. But they immediately also fall back to, when it comes to the big items, the auto sector and others, except for the motorcycle, they're looking at the urban market. It's really trying to get an economy which has a dynamic which is not urban based. In other words, you need players who can grow from within rural ranks or which choose to situate themselves. It can be startups, new startups. It could even be large existing companies which say, look here, this is our mission, this is the way we're going to do it. But if it doesn't happen, it's not going to happen because markets are going to make it happen. All the incentives are to actually stick around where the costs are lowest. And for many things, the costs have been lowest in urban areas simply because all of these services provided by the migrants were coming very cheap. Now that they've gone away, maybe things have changed a bit, but not a great deal. Now, these are issues, I think, looking into the future, someone, somewhere, Niti Aayog, whoever it is, must look at as much as tariffs, taxes, subsidies for industrial policy. And the reason it must do this is because of one thing that a lot of people have talked about, or at least one question, which is climate change. If you're really actually going to think in terms of climate change seriously and environmental problems seriously, we must recognize that the one thing that the climate change is assuredly doing, and it's evident to everybody, is that extreme events, whether these are floods or droughts, whether these are hurricanes or protracted periods where locusts get in, are becoming more frequent. And if the frequency of these things increase, then to have most of our capital locked up in a few regions, Bangalore, Tamil Nadu, Madras, Bombay, Delhi, rather than an economy which is widespread across the country, is a more dangerous way of proceeding. But more importantly, it is only in a more disaggregated economy where we can actually think in terms of new technologies which are not overly dependent on the kind of energy systems that we at the moment have, and which is responsible for climate change. Now, climate change itself, of course, and Madam Principal pointed at, is usually often addressed for a different reason. And that is, what will it do to our future food security? My own observation on that is, yes, almost everything we know means that in a country like India, yields per acre are likely to go down. So that in 20 years' time, climate alone might push down our yields per hectare by anywhere between 10 and 20%. Now, is that a matter for great concern? Luckily, possibly not. Because two things have happened. Number one, our population growth has slowed down very considerably. So we will need less food than in incremental terms than we had in the past. And the second is that yes, climate change will of course reduce yields from their existing levels. But our yield rate of growth, if it is maintained at least 1%, and we've actually been having yield rates of growth close to 3 at times, we should be well within the numbers required to keep our population not only as well fed as they are today, but to improve their sustenance. I'm not so bothered on that. I'm bothered much more on the costs that climate change puts on people in terms of where they stand in society. And in that, and in what is happening at the moment, it is important to raise certain old issues again. And these old issues, for example, are that can you have a situation where in rural areas, something like 40% of the population have almost no assets, no land. They are the agricultural laborers. Many among them are the people who are the migrants. And can you actually have inclusiveness of that kind with that sort of a background? Especially when almost all of them belong to lower castes. And more importantly, that in that situation, can we actually expect a growth of demand which will drive the economy towards the sort of inclusive growth that is required for growth to become more diversified, more rural oriented. It's not going to happen if the wealth remains concentrated in the hands of those who are emulating urban tastes and in fact sending their children there, retiring in urban areas, leaving behind people in rural areas who don't have the wherewithal to create that rural drive. These are issues that normally we don't think, but the pandemic and the current situation, including that we were having a period of slowing growth even before the pandemic, are things which are important to remember, that there is a definite demand problem, and that demand problem has to do with the lack of inclusivity. And in the case of climate change, this is important because one of the things which climate change requires is building a green investment policy, which is more labor intensive, which tries to conserve things rather than create grand structures. And in that, I certainly think inclusivity is important. To wind up, because my time is more or less finished, I don't think food self-sufficiency should be a major concern, but certainly making agriculture more profitable should. Diversification of agriculture, diversification of diets, making our diets better than simply depend upon roti and chawal, are very important things. And those are areas which we must concentrate on, as indeed I think we have been. But as Madam Principal again said, that we need to do a lot more. So let me end now. If there is any questions that anyone has picked up, and if the technology allows it, I'll answer it.
Actually, sir, all the questions that we have received have already been answered by your very enlightening speech. It has been indeed a very insightful session for all of us, and we are very grateful for you for sparing our time to guide us and mention the different facets of the Indian economy that need focus upon, be it agriculture, inclusive growth, and rural focused growth of food sufficiency, and where does India stand of it, and the factor of climate change and green investment. We also would like to thank respected Principal Ma'am for her support, Faculty Advisor of FIC SRCC, Ms. Saroj Ma'am, faculty members and participants. I would now like to invite the Faculty Advisor of FIC SRCC, Ms. Saroj Joshi, to conclude the session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abhijit Sen, sir. It was such a wonderful and enlightening session, and it was a pleasure listening to you. And I think all of us have benefited a lot from your session. And the one key aspect that we can take from this is that there is a need for inclusive growth, and the focus should definitely be to take everyone together. And for inclusive growth and green energy, these should be the areas of focus. I would also like to thank our principal, Madam Simrit ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your continuous support and guidance. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank my FIC team for organizing this session and my dear colleagues and all the participants for attending the session. It was a pleasure having you all with us. Thank you all. Goodbye. Have a good day.
Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you once again, sir, for being with us
Thank
and
you.
sharing your thoughts, deep thoughts with us. With gratitude from Shri Ram College of Commerce. And we do hope, as always, your continuous support and words of wisdom. We will be having the privilege to hearing you time and again.